Hello, little one. Are you ready for some more stories with Oma? You climb on in, snuggle up close in the rocking chair, listen to the calm sounds of the fire and the rain outside. Isn't it nice and cozy to be inside when all of that is outside? Today, Oma is going to read another chapter from the adventures of Hitty, the 100-year-old doll. So sit back, snuggle in, and let's listen to Hitty, Chapter 3, in which I travel by land and sea. Because my clothes had suffered so much from crows, rain, and sharp twigs, I was unable to be seen much in polite society. But after my late experiences, I was thankful enough to stay in a neat little cradle Captain Pribble had made in odd moments. Phoebe's mother had promised to cut out new garments for me as soon as she could find the time. But time was evidently very hard to find in the Pribble house in those days, for the captain was soon to sail on another long voyage. It was to be a whaling trip this time, and he had bought more than half interest in the ship Diana, which was being repaired and fitted out in Boston. And so it came to be September, with such a shine on sea and leaf and every grass blade that even I experienced a strange springing feeling down to my very pegs. Never since then have I heard crickets make such high and persistent chirpings. All day and all night you might hear them at it in the brown, burnt grass. "They're singing to keep the cold away," Andy told Phoebe one night as we three sat on the doorstep watching the big red fall moon rise behind the seaward islands. "And can they?" Phoebe was always very curious about such things. "No," Andy assured her, "they only think they can. The colder it turns, the louder they holler, but the frost always gets 'em. You wait and see." "I'm glad we're not crickets," said Phoebe, hugging me tighter, as if she feared I might turn into one. That night, after the whole house was still and everyone in bed, I lay in my cradle and listened to them and thought of what Andy had said. I, too, felt very glad I was not a cricket. Captain Preble was forever riding over to Portland to see if the post that came by stage 3 times a week from Boston had brought him news of the Diana. There had been many delays about the ship's outfitting, and the captain was growing impatient. "Reuben Soames is first-rate at striking whales," I heard him tell his wife one day, "but he's no hand at getting the ship overhauled. Guess I'll have to go up to Boston by the next stagecoach if we expect to weigh anchor before November. This is the last time I put in at Boston. It'll be Portland for me from now on." "Now, Dan'l, don't you go off before I get your 12th pair of socks knitted," his wife begged. "I couldn't rest easy here at home if I thought you was sloshing round in wet feet." "Guess there's nothing for it but to fetch you along to Boston with me day after tomorrow," he laughed. "You can finish them on the way and fit yourself and Phoebe out with new winter woolens in style." "My goodness, Dan'l, and who ever heard of such nonsense?" she answered with a serious headshake. "You always were one for extravagance. 2 lamps burning and no ship at sea." Her words puzzled me at the time, but I later learned that this was a phrase often used by wives of whalers and meant that someone was spending what he had not yet earned. I was to hear many such sea terms before very long. Somehow or other, the captain always got his way. So it came about that one fine fall morning we all set off to catch the Boston stage. The sun had been up only a little while as we went clattering away, leaving the square white Preble house, the red barn, and the ancestral pine behind us. Little did I think, as these familiar shapes slipped from view, that I was not to see them again in another week. No, not one of us guessed then all that lay before us as we turned into the Portland road. Such a morning as it was, too. I shall never forget the scarlet of the swamp maples by every pond or bit of marshy land, the bright yellow of elms and birches, and the flaming red of woodbine that made the fences look as if they had burst into flame. It was goldenrod and asters all the way to Portland. "There, Kate," said the captain, suddenly pointing with his whip. "That's the first mountain ash tree I've seen this fall." There, sure enough, at the edge of some woods was a slim, tallish tree loaded down with bunches of orange berries. The tree seemed to bend under their weight, and they shone like burnished balls. "That's Hitty's tree," cried Phoebe, "and it's magic." "Hush, child," reproved her mother. "You mustn't say such things." "But the old peddler said so, Mother," Phoebe insisted. "Don't you remember when he was making her? He said it was a charm against evil." "Well, now, I guess he was just giving you a fish story," put in the captain hastily, for he saw his wife look rather stern. "Anyhow, it's what I call a pretty sight. Get up, Charlie, or we'll be too late for the stage." We were in plenty of time, however. In fact, the Prebbles were able to stop for donuts, gingerbread, and glasses of cider at Cousin Robinson's on Congress Street, where Charlie and the gig were to be left while we were away. There are no such stagecoaches nowadays, or such fine, prancing horses to draw them. This one was painted red and yellow, and the 4 horses were matched in pairs, 2 grays and 2 chestnuts. The spokes of the wheels were painted black, and when they turned very fast, it made one quite dizzy, especially if one hung out of the window and looked down. Perhaps this was the matter with Phoebe, for after we had been jolting and rumbling along for about an hour, she complained of not feeling well. Captain Preble and Andy had climbed on top with several other men and boys and the driver. However, there were 2 or 3 ladies riding inside with us, and they were full of sympathy and advice. One brought out peppermint lozenges, another lemon drops, and I think there were other remedies in the shape of dried licorice roots and homemade spruce beer. Phoebe tried them all, but none made her feel any better. She grew very pale and was glad to lie still with closed eyes as we rolled along at a fine pace. I am afraid, her mother told the other ladies with a doleful headshake, that she must have inherited a weak stomach. It runs in our family. I was happy to think that I was subject to no such discomfort, though, of course, I had been unable to indulge in the cider and gingerbread at Cousin Robinson's. I suppose that may have had something to do with it. We stayed the night at a fine old tavern in Portsmouth, and were off again before daylight. Fresh horses were harnessed, and the stage was soon rumbling towards Salem. Phoebe proved herself a better traveler the second day, and her mother chatted with 2 new lady passengers, her needles clicking briskly as she continued to knit the captain's socks. So, past harbors and headlands, by farms and fields and elm-shaded village streets, we came at last to Salem. Here was a fine harbor full of ships and larger houses than I had ever seen before. We walked up and down in the early twilight. Some of the houses were of brick, with small square balconies built on their roofs about the chimneys. Captain's walks, Phoebe's father said they were called, because one could walk there and see what vessels were in the harbor. Her mother kept marveling at the size and grandeur of the homes we passed, admiring the elaborate carving over doors and windows and the handsome furnishings that we caught glimpses of within. "They can afford it," her husband explained. "Salem's about the richest port there is in these parts. If I was to take you down to the wharves, you'd see 'em floated down with cargoes from India and China and heaven knows where. Maybe if I strike luck this voyage and bring back 600 or 700 barrels of sperm, we can come and live here too. How'd you like that, Kate?" But his wife shook her head. "You know well enough I wouldn't live anywhere except in the state of Maine. But I suppose there's no harm in my admiring other folks' front doors and parlor curtains, is there?" The captain allowed there wasn't. By the next evening, we were settled in Boston in a couple of rooms an old lady let out to sailors' families. The captain had known her since he was a boy, and she welcomed us warmly. From her upper windows, we could see the harbor with a perfect forest of masts where the vessels lay anchored near the wharves. The captain had gone at once to his ship, taking Andy with him. Phoebe and I were through supper and in bed by the time he returned. He sounded worried and kept repeating over and over, that he should have come before, and how they must get off soon if they were to make headway against the autumn gales. Some of his best men were sick or had signed up for other ships. The vessel was only half fitted out, and he could not find a proper cook. This last difficulty seemed to worry him most of all. Ship's cooks were apparently scarce that year. Several more days passed. The captain was busier than ever down at the wharves. I had a feeling that something was going to happen, so I was not surprised when he came back one night and had a long talk with Phoebe's mother. I could not hear much of what they said, for Phoebe and I were in bed, and they sat with their heads close together by the little glass lamp on the table. Captain Preble had charts spread out before him, besides a great many other papers, and his wife listened to him so intently as he talked, and pointed things out to her with his big forefinger, that she let her knitting lie idle in her lap. "Well, Daniel," she said at last, "I'll take the night to think it over and let you know by morning. I never lotted on going to sea, least of all to cook for a parcel of hungry men and one of these greasy old blubber hunters, as you call 'em. 'Twon't be so bad as you think," he told her. "There ain't another vessel has had so good an overhauling. You can fix your cabin up most as nice as you was at home, and as for the work, well, you'll have someone to do for you hand and foot. But when I think of my kitchen at home," she sighed, "and all my jelly there on the table, and our cow with the neighbors, and Charlie eating his head off with oats in Portland, I don't hardly feel I can." "Don't you mind about that," he assured her. "Well, if I do go, the name of that ship's got to be changed to something more Christian." She spoke very firmly. "They say it's bad luck to change a vessel's name," the captain told her. "Not that I hold to that sort of thing, but crews get notions, and you have to humor 'em." But his wife held firmly to her convictions. "Crew or no crew," said she, "I don't set foot on any ship with such a heathen-sounding name." So the captain said he would see what could be done, and by breakfast time the next morning it was all settled that we should go. Phoebe and I spent most of the day by ourselves, for the captain and his wife were both far too busy making last purchases and seeing to all the final preparations on the eve of our departure. We were glad enough when Andy put in his appearance after supper to help a couple of big sailors carry down boxes. Andy acted very important and proud of himself in the new pea jacket and sea boots that Captain Preble had bought him. He seemed years older than he had a week before, and took his new duties as cabin boy very seriously. I did not think he sounded particularly pleased to have us going along. "They all say a vessel's no place for women folks," he explained to us, "and they don't want you to go only for the pie and donuts." "Well, I don't care what they say," Phoebe told him with an emphatic shake of her curls. "We're going. Father said so this morning, and he's captain." It was well after sunset by the time we went down to the wharves, but we could make out the dark outlines of hulls and masts and the shapes of men and piled-up cargoes in the flickering light of lanterns and the thin fall dusk. "There she is," said the captain suddenly, pointing to a looming shape alongside of the wharf. "That's your new home, Phoebe. Reckon you're going to like it?" We were swung aboard like so many parcels. High overhead, the masthead lantern gleamed whitely in a circle of paler light it sent out into the darkness. Below us, strapped into a little sling of a seat, a man was whistling as he moved a big brush to and fro. Captain Preble beckoned us over to watch him. "There's Jim," he said to his wife, "following your orders." Then as she looked at him blankly, he smiled and explained. "He's painting new letters to her name. She's going to be the Diana Kate from now on. Guess you and that old heathen lady goddess might's well get used to each other, for you're going to have about 11 months of keeping close company there astern." And so our voyage began. Chapter 4, in which we go to sea. That night, Phoebe and I spent on a horsehair sofa of extraordinary slipperiness in the after cabin of the Diana Kate. Later, Phoebe was to have a berth fitted for her in the captain's quarters, but our coming had been so unexpected there was time for nothing besides getting the vessel in readiness to weigh anchor. "I am to put out by 4, I heard Captain Preble telling the man that Andy had called the mate, "and we'll make the tide serve us out." I remember his words distinctly, for I considered it very obliging of the tide to be willing to serve us. It amazes me to think how ignorant I was then of the simplest sea phrases. All that night, as Phoebe and I slid and slipped on the horsehair, I listened to the strange sounds which were to become familiar to me for many months. Such rattlings and squeakings, and such grinding of chains and clumping of boots on the wooden decks overhead. There were cries as well that I could not make out. It was all very enlivening. When Phoebe carried me up to the steep steps of the companionway and on deck next morning, we found the Diana Kate running before the wind. Her square sails were billowing out in fine fashion, and her bow dipped and rose to be lifted by great blue-green combers, the like of which I had never seen before. This ain't nothing," Andy told us as Phoebe nearly lost her footing when the deck suddenly seemed to slip from under her. "You just wait till we get round by old Hatteras, and then you'll see something." "A lot you know about Hatteras, young man," said a deep voice nearby, and a big man in faded blue trousers and shirt stopped beside us. "You run along down to the galley and help same's you're here for. Scud now." Andy scudded as he was told. He disappeared down the stairs we had just climbed, and presently the smell of coffee began to mingle with the sea air. The big sailor lifted Phoebe to a seat on a carpenter's wooden bench. This stood amidships, near what I later learned were the try-works, but which then looked to me only like deep pits of brick built into the deck between the masts. Several men were working nearby at odd jobs. They were all brown and big, like the first. "Well, so we've got ladies aboard this trip, eh, Bill?" One greeted us, giving Phoebe a knowing wink as he made the most intricate knottings of rope between his fingers. "S'pose that means we'll have to mind our P's and Q's." Phoebe was being measured for the new bunk she was to sleep in, and I for a little rope hammock which the sailor named Elijah, called Lige for short, had promised to make me. They were so jolly and friendly, and the strong sea sunshine felt so good, with the wind blowing and the big ballooning sails throwing shadows on each other, that I felt only pleasure as I looked out upon the miles of tossing blue water before us. Not a single regret to see the far hump of land that was Boston disappearing from sight. Phoebe was only a little seasick those first days out, and the rest of us not at all. Andy sang and whistled and danced hornpipes the crew taught him. Even Mrs. Preble grew more resigned to the cramped quarters of the ship's galley, and made a batch of molasses cookies big enough for all, a rare treat indeed for a whaling ship, or for any vessel, in those days. Although there were still one or two who grumbled and made dire predictions about the presence of women aboard a whaler, we were for the most part treated with real consideration. In fact, Phoebe Preble and I were soon on such friendly terms with various members of the crew that her mother complained there would be no living with the child when we got home again. I, too, felt a distinct sense of my own importance when Lige and his special crony, one Reuben Soames, said that they had no doubt I would bring them good luck on this voyage. They decided this after Phoebe had told them the story of my being made of mountain ash wood. "Why, now, she'd ought to be as much good to us as old Lady Diana down yonder," Reuben said, pointing toward the carved figurehead just under the bowsprit. I must confess that I felt a little frightened lest he should suggest that I too be nailed in a like position, to be drenched in salt spray whenever the vessel took any particularly big wave. I did not envy the poor lady. I was far too grateful for all my privileges, especially for the little hammock Lige had made me. I had other presents as well, for the men all seemed to be clever at making things from odds and ends of rope, chips, or bits of wood. They vied with one another at fitting me out, and before we were many weeks out, I possessed not only a hammock to sleep in, but also a chip basket, a carved bone footstool, and a sea chest to hold all my possessions. This last was the gift of Bill Buckle, who spared no pains to make it perfect in every respect. It was painted a beautiful bright blue, with proper rope handles at each end and my initials, H.P., picked out in tiny nail heads on the lid. That was a proud day for me, and Phoebe was so pleased she ran all over the ship exhibiting it. She was all for climbing up to the crow's nest to show the lookout, but her father soon put a stop to that. And this reminds me. I was greatly upset the first time I heard mention of the crow's nest. Naturally, my own trying experiences in the old pine were still fresh in my memory, and I had no desire to repeat them. However, I soon discovered my mistake, and later on it became one of my greatest diversions to watch the men climb up the ratlines to take their turns at watching for whales from that little black perch so high above the rigging. But I am getting a trifle ahead of myself, for it was not until we were well past the Horn and heading into the South Seas that our whaling adventures began in earnest. The weather was generally so mild and fine, the wind so brisk and steady, that we made excellent runs during our first months out. Different seamen, as well as Andy, took turns at helping Mrs. Preble in the little galley that served as kitchen, tending the kettle halyards, they called it, in their own particular sea talk. She was growing used to the ship, and when things had been going their best, she was heard to declare that except for the lack of a few neighbors to drop in of an evening, and a decent sink for washing dishes, and a cow to give us milk, she could think of a lot worse places to spend one's days in. There were, of course, other times, such as Sundays, when she sighed, remembering how many miles lay between us and Meeting House Hill. Then she would call Andy and Phoebe to her to make sure that they had not forgotten the commandments and the 23rd Psalm. Bill Buckle was now our constant companion, and we were on such intimate terms with him that he even went as far as to loan Andy his jackknife and showed us all his best tattoo marks. Nearly all the men aboard were tattooed, but none could show such elaborate decorations as his, for there were mermaids and sea serpents in green on one arm, an anchor and a whale in blue on the other, while a clipper ship in full rig and 3 colors was sailing straight across his chest. Andy was very envious of these pictures, but it was rather discouraging to find how much Bill Buckle had paid to have them done. He did agree, however, to tattoo Andy's initials across his chest the first chance he got. Phoebe felt a trifle left out when she heard this and was all for having mine done too. This frightened me considerably, and I was thankful enough when Bill came to my rescue by declaring that he didn't hold with tattooing for ladies. Kind Bill Buckle. I can see his great brown fingers now, his bristling black beard, and his eyes that squinted into pale blue slits when he looked far off to sea. Another great favorite of ours was Jeremy Folger from Nantucket. He had had a fall from a yardarm in his youth, so he told us, and this had given him a hump on his back for life. It made him cut a queer figure, but in no way unfitted him for ship's duties. In fact, Captain Preble counted himself lucky to have Jeremy aboard this trip, for he was known to be one of the best harpooners anywhere about. He had the keenest eyes as well as the steadiest aim. There was a rumor, which Andy and Phoebe firmly believed, that he could sight a whale spouting, or rather blowing, as they called it, fully 9 miles away. He had no beard like the rest, and his straw-colored hair was bleached almost white by the strong sea sunshine. This gave him the oddest appearance. To this day, I do not know whether he was near 20 or 70. One night, I heard Captain Preble tell his wife the only thing that bothered him was that everything was drawing most too well. Just when that was, it is difficult to remember, for there was little to separate one long blue salty day from the one that came before or after it. However, soon after we had come around that mysterious place they all called the Horn, the Diana Kate struck a spell of bad weather. The storm came on quite suddenly late one afternoon, and there was barely time to get canvas lashed and hatches battened down before we were in the teeth of it. No more sunny hours of leisure and yarn spinning on deck, but 2 days and nights of pounding, tossing, and buffetings such as no pen can describe. The rocking and roaring about the nest in the old pine were as nothing to what I now experienced. "Now, don't you go and get wodgety, Kate," Captain Preble told his wife, as he took a final look about the cabin to make sure all was tight before going on deck. "It won't be exactly smooth sailing for a spell, but I've put through worse than this is going to be. I mean to heave and heave to and lay under bare poles till this is over with. Well, put on an extra pair of socks, Daniel, and take your muffler aloft, was all she said, but I could see that she was worried. What did he mean about laying under bare poles? Phoebe asked curiously. Means he don't dast have an inch of sail up, Andy told her. Guess I'll go above and have a look around. You won't do any such thing, Mrs. Preble spoke up briskly. It's all the men can do to keep their footing on deck. You'd be washed overboard in no time. You come right in the galley with me and help get the fire going and some hot soup ready. Dear knows they'll need it tonight if they never did before. Although it was long before the time, Phoebe and I were put to bed in her little bunk and tied in firmly with an old piece of flannel. Can't have you falling down and breaking your bones, her mother said when she protested. We've got trouble enough on our hands as 'tis. So, in bed we stayed, though it was impossible to sleep in all the racket going on about us. A single oil lamp hung in the main cabin just outside. This was the only light, dim and rather smoky at best. And now, with the ship reeling and plunging with such violence, it swung crazily about, making eerie shadows that frightened Phoebe into tears. But since no one heard her above the commotion, and if they had, all were too busy to stop and reassure her, she finally ducked her head under the blankets and held me close. Oh, Hitty, she whispered, I didn't think going to sea would be like this. Did you? It seemed as if that night would never turn into morning, and when it did, we were no better off, for it was almost as dark and noisy below as at midnight. To add to our discomfort, water poured down whenever the hatchway was opened, and even when it was not. It managed to seep in as often as a particularly huge wave broke over Diana Kate's bow and made her decks awash with tons of salt water. Already there were several inches on the cabin floor, and Mrs. Preble was in despair trying to keep the fire alive. You'd best stay in your bunk, same's Phoebe, the captain told her on one of his few trips below. I'd send one of the crew down to help you, but truth is I can't spare one of 'em. She sprung a leak forward, and it takes 4 to keep her bailed out. Mercy, Daniel, I heard Mrs. Preble cry. Ain't that pretty bad? Well, I can't say it's exactly good, he answered as he stood by the cabin door, gulping down some hot tea she had brought him in a tin cup. Trouble is, we can't commence patching till this lets up, but it's bound to for long if we can just ride it out. How that day passed, I do not know. All I remember of it is the absolute certainty that the Diana Kate's next downward plunge would surely send us to the bottom. Whenever she rose, shuddering and straining in every beam, I felt it must be for the last time, and then once more we would begin to sink down, down, till it seemed impossible we could ever climb again out of such a watery hollow. The noise grew to be so great that even the men's shrillest shouts to one another could scarcely be heard above the sloshings and poundings, the thud and crash of waves breaking over and about us, and the wind that howled and tore at masts till it seemed they must crack in two. Indeed, during that second night of storm, it increased with such violence that the accident occurred which was so nearly our finish. By this time, what with the leak we had sprung and the force of the waves breaking over our bows, the forecastle was partly underwater. Those of the crew who ordinarily slept there must snatch the few winks of sleep allowed them in the cabin. Not that any part of the ship was dry now, but they were too wet from their struggles overhead to notice a few inches of water underfoot. Once or twice we caught sight of Jeremy or Bill Buckle or other special cronies who were too spent and dripping to give us more than a nod or grin. It was no time for pleasantry, I can tell you. Several of the men were gathered there trying to wring some of the wet from their soaked jackets when there came a particularly strong gust of wind. We could feel the Diana Kate shiver under the force of it, and then came a sound of such horrid ripping and splintering that it makes me terrified to think of it even now in the quiet of the antique shop. There followed a noise of hurrying feet on deck, more cracking, and Captain Preble bellowing out commands in a voice that sounded no bigger than a cricket chirping above the tumult. "Cut her away, boys," he was shouting. "Let her go, topsail and all." I saw the 3 men who had been lounging in the cabin leap to their feet and go staggering up the companionway. Even in the wavering light of the oil lamp, I could make out how pale Phoebe's mother had grown as she started up from her place in the bunk below us. She clung to the child with one hand, while with the other she kept herself from falling. "What's happened, Mother? Are we going to sink?" Phoebe cried, seeing the fright in her face. "Not if your father can help it," her mother answered, but her eyes were enormous, and she never even noticed that she was standing in water to her ankles. "I don't believe we will. Not with Hitty aboard," Phoebe reminded her. "She's made of mountain ashwood, and you know that's sure to bring us good luck." But Mrs. Preble was too anxious to hear or reprove her. After what seemed a long time, things quieted down somewhat above us. The men returned to the cabin, and the captain came down for a moment to reassure his wife. From him, we learned that the main topmast had snapped in two, and it had been necessary for several of the crew to climb up and cut it away. Topsail, yardarm, and dear knows how much besides. "Yes," he said, shaking the wet from his beard and eyebrows, "it's gone over the side, and lucky we didn't follow it." "Oh, Dan'l," his wife cried out, "can't you let me get you a dry shirt?" But he was gone before she could make her way over to the chest. Later on, Andy visited us. He had been with the men in the cabin, and so had gathered much news about our situation. He crawled into our bunk and sat cross-legged at the foot while he regaled Phoebe with all he had learned. "They thought we were gone for good that time," he told us. "Bill Buckle said it looked as if we were going to join the fishes in another 5 minutes, only for Jeremy and Lige cutting off the topmast and sail in such a hurry. Captain knew it was the only way, but old Patch is terrible mad. He was all for trying to save it." Patch was the first mate, a stoop-shouldered, sandy man who had never muttered more than a curt good morning to us since we set sail. I had never liked him, and now I felt sure that he meant no good to any of us. "He was all agin having women folks along," Andy went on. "They say he'd done everything he could, only the captain went over his head. Now he's going around saying we're getting our bad luck, same as he said we would be for having you aboard. Bill Buckle don't pay no heed to him, but he says there's some that does, though he ain't mentioning names."